Thank you so much
Okay.
for joining me, Kat. I really appreciate you taking the time. Could you please introduce yourself and your channel for the benefit of our audience?
I'm Kat Marchant, and my channel is called Reading the Past.
What motivated you to start this channel? I'm guessing it was a passion project, or was it more related to your academic studies?
So, after I completed my PhD, I was quickly aware that I didn't want a long-term career in the academy. I wanted to get out of that space and work with other human beings and share office spaces and things like that. And I wanted to get into heritage, but I also wanted to be able to use the very great privilege I've had to have this education and to share it in ways that I find meaningful and fun. So the channel started off as a hobby. Then the pandemic hit, and I was very fortunate because all of my work went away and my channel then became my job. So I was very lucky that it happened that way. So it's gone from being a hobby and a passion project to share research to being one of my main jobs.
Thanks for that. I found that's a common theme among the good history YouTubers who really put in a lot of work. Something starts as a passion project. Quite a few channels started during the pandemic, and then they transitioned in one way or another, either to a side gig, a significant side gig, or in your case, a full-time position or a full-time occupation. So could you please tell me a little bit about your academic qualifications, because you're one of the few YouTubers I've interviewed who has academic qualifications and high ones as well, and the area of study in which you've specialized and why you chose that specialization.
Sure thing. So I'll start from the university period. My BA was in English and theatre studies. In the process of getting my English literature BA, I went down the Shakespeare rabbit hole heavily. Then for the masters, I focused on a topic that at my university was called early modern literature and culture.
Mm.
So that looks at essentially literary and cultural history from the early modern period. So around the time of Shakespeare, maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after. And then my doctorate was also in that. So technically my doctorate is from the School of English, but the focus of study involves, so in my doctoral thesis, I look at things like art history, economic history, post-colonial history, women's history, theatre history, book history, corpus linguistics. So it sort of layers on. It's very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work. And the research method leans into looking at histories. And I think what it's done is when I approach histories, the reason why the channel is called Reading the Past is because I read all of these things as texts, in a kind of literary way. I'm thinking about who's producing it, who's consuming it, what is the intention. So that's the kind of way I approach history, is that both in primary and secondary sources, these things are being produced with a consumer in mind. And there
That's
are
fantastic.
biases.
Right. Yeah, I see. And so, as I understand it, you see yourself as a history communicator in this role.
Yes. Yeah, history communicator, public historian. I think also, my other side of my work is that I do actually communicate history to school students in heritage sites. So I'm a heritage professional as well. And I also do historical interpretation. So my connection to history is educational at all levels, but it's also performative. I have spent years putting on costumes and becoming people who talk to the public. So I've inhabited those. And I like to think of that as a form of experimental archaeology, that when you're wearing fairly accurate costumes and moving around spaces that history happened in, and you're trying to figure out how you eat and dance, all of that kind of stuff, that those additional things help you to understand the past in certain ways.
I would certainly agree with that from my own limited experience as somebody who is a practitioner of historical European martial arts. In particular, when I wear armor, and that's not exactly completely period accurate, but very accurate based on historical sources, not museum replica level, but still based very accurately on actual historical and museum pieces. It's amazing what you learn from what you've referred to there as experimental archaeology. I'd like to make a video actually about what they don't tell you about wearing armor, something like that,
Yeah.
to communicate my understanding.
I actually also did a historical European martial art, but not in
Oh,
armor.
fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah,
Yep.
I
Yep.
I fenced the Saviolo system from
Oh,
1595,
oh, excellent. Right. Right.
rapier and dagger form. So
Oh,
it's more
excellent. Right. Right.
yeah, and that connects to the theatre, and it sort of makes me understand that when Shakespeare's people are fighting. So I think, for example, whoever played his Hamlet and his Laertes, they are probably also his Tybalt and his Mercutio. These are
Yes. Yes.
people who can converse with a sword. So they're not. Nobody's teaching them stage combat. Nobody's teaching them that.
Right.
But gone and fought in a fencing sal, and then
Yes.
they have brought that to the stage and they are conversing because the theatre spaces also had fencing displays. The people
Yes.
who are
Right.
watching are used to seeing people fight for real, and it's like a
Mm.
sport. For me, when I see some sort of stage combat in Shakespeare plays now and the people don't seem to know how to hold the sword, it would be the equivalent at the time of somebody walking out and saying, let's play football, but holding it like a rugby ball. There's physical knowledge that doesn't come from 3 sessions with a stage combat professional.
I just sent you there in chat
Yeah.
an image of my own armor.
Oh, that's so cool.
That is based on Cherbourg S18. That is, the plate is based on Cherbourg S18. The gauntlets are standard late 14th, early 15th century hourglass gauntlets, as you would guess.
Yeah.
I am pairing Cherbourg S18 here with rather cheekily with a German bicoque, a 15th century German bicoque, simply because I like the style and also I like the level of protection, because this is something you can actually physically fence in. Whereas,
Yep.
as you would know, some of the helmets were designed for, obviously, okay, for combat, but for modern safety concerns, they don't quite meet our standard. But yes, the helmet is an absolute work of art. The crown was raised from a single piece, and the blacksmith in the Ukraine made it from hardened steel. It weighs about 5 kilograms, and he based it on one of the few surviving German bicoques in the museum. And he actually studied the piece itself, studied photos of it, and reproduced it. So that's a very, very high level reproduction. The other armor,
it's incredible.
Yeah, the other armor is based very nicely on S18, with some slight modifications made to satisfy modern safety concerns and also practicality, but it does have some very, very nice features. I'd like to talk about my armor one day in a video. Although the helmet is in hardened steel, made in hardened steel, the rest of the armor I had made in titanium for the weight.
Okay.
And also so I don't have to derust it, which is a terrible burden.
Every fingerprint tells a story.
Yes, and this is something else you don't find. Well, you don't really find in the source, except that you do occasionally know that this is the page boy's job or the squire's job. Yeah. He's rolling it in the barrel of sand, that kind of thing. But this kind of derusting, it's not something that the knight has to worry about, so he just doesn't have to mention it. I really want to make a comment about Shakespeare, actually a couple of comments, a couple of questions. One's a little bit cheeky, but one of them's far more serious. Firstly, I'm expecting you have a comment on, or a view on, the Shakespeare authorship issue, which I've never even seen contested very seriously in mainstream scholarship. I'm interested in perhaps more in your view of why that kind of is still around in the background. Do you have any idea about that?
I'll be honest with you, I'm slightly nervous because I've made a video just laying out the authorship debate, talking about, Bacon, the Baconites, the Oxfordians, even the Elizabeth Chimera theory. Yeah, all of them. I made a video just sort of laying them out. And in that video, I made the mistake of saying that I think that this has more to do with a Victorian idea about the capacities of class. Yeah, what people of certain classes are capable of, what art made by people who don't have a university education surely can't be that good, that it has much more to do with that than anything to do with the son of the Glover, the man from Stratford. And I also made the mistake of saying that based upon the available evidence that I have seen, for me, the son of the Glover, the man from Stratford, wrote the plays that are attributed to him. With that being said, I think there is a lot of collaboration going on. I also think that he is borrowing from existing narratives. Lots of these things are not original stories. They are reworkings of Italian stories, of history texts that already exist. And any argument that says, well, we don't know if he has a library, he doesn't have access to books. He is a Lord Chamberlain's man who then becomes a king's man. He has access to books because of course he has access to books. But the reason why I'm nervous about it is when I made that video, I got death threats.
Oh dear. No.
And I just, yeah, it got really abusive in the comments, which I thought was just, I'll be honest, a little bit unhinged, because I wasn't even saying anything, that people who believe this stuff are stupid, because I don't think that. I think that the academy in some ways has done the whole thing a disservice, because they shut down the question. And when they talk about it, they do it dismissively often, and they ridicule the people who are asking the question. I don't think that's the way to behave. However, having had that experience, I now don't want to touch it with somebody else's.
Yes, right. Having actually taught Shakespeare to students, high school students, one of the issues which always comes up is Shakespeare's enormous vocabulary. And we don't need to get into debate exactly how big it is. Everybody knows it was just very large. And I was very interested by the fact that you mentioned, yes, he was obviously multilingual, at least to some extent. And there are so many words that he uses which we don't even know the meaning of, and they don't appear in English corpora. So they're literally hapax legomena. And I'm wondered if some of those he may be actually loan words from other languages, and he's kind of tweaked them. Do you have any comment on that mysterious body of vocabulary they uses, which just don't appear? We know some of them might be dialect words, which were just so used so narrowly, they just weren't found, because we know he obviously had a dialect. But I was wondering if you actually had any thoughts on that.
So he gets the credit for inventing however many terms. Words.
Yes. But we know he must be borrowing some of those. I mean, we know he gets quoted when really he's quoting the Bible, for example.
Yeah, he also, and he misappropriating and misquoting it as well. Sometimes sometimes because he's made a mistake. He is living somewhere in Southwark or the environs, and he's almost certainly knocking about in East London. So he's probably he's almost certainly encountering Italians. He's knocking about with John Florio. He's probably knows some of the French Protestants who have come over, who are worshipping in the French Protestant and the Dutch Protestant churches. So he's encountering these individuals in his day-to-day life. These are the people that come to his theatre. And just as in London now, and for all eternity, essentially, in the various parts of London, the accent and the word usage are determined by the various locations where the people have come from. London has been a global city for centuries. So it's undeniable that a third generation French Protestant is going to be anglicising and slangifying the terms of their grandparents. And so I think Shakespeare's hearing these things. And I think that when we don't know what this word means, or it's not in other English corporates, because he's hanging around with various people who other people aren't necessarily hanging around with. And he additionally doesn't have the university education that means that if you read Marlowe, this might be controversial, it's a cleaner text.
Right.
It's very clear what is meant. I think weirdly, because people apologise for doing Christopher Marlowe's work, I think he's easier to understand. I think it's very clear what's happening. I think with Ben Jonson, although some of the scenarios that get set up are a bit weird, the language is less opaque. Shakespeare's language, I think, is more opaque, and I wonder, can't prove it, if that is because his writing style and his linguistic style is more influenced by his local community and doesn't have that foundational basis of being a university scholar. I wonder.
That's a really interesting answer. And I like your reference to the class issue there as well, not just his personal background and the people he's moving around with, but the differentiation between the language of the academy, which may be, well, as a result of the university environment, it is going to be more constrained by the established dialect, for want of a better term, the Queen's English, as opposed to Shakespeare, who's going to be using something, I guess, closer to street language, or at least lower class, not the rarefied and much more codified language of the academy. The other serious question I had about Shakespeare was your view on Shakespeare as historical source, not only for the period, but for the earlier periods in which his work is set. Not obviously so much, what do we learn about Denmark from Hamlet, because nobody's really thinking that. But when he's depicting in particular earlier monarchs, particularly those related to the current monarch, to what extent do you think his history can be trusted, or does he really have one eye on the Queen, thinking, well, I better make sure this sounds okay, regardless of what we actually know happened? To what extent can we use Shakespeare as a historical source, and what caveats do we need when we're interpreting him as a window into his own time and earlier times?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that Shakespeare, by and large, is repurposing Holinshed's Chronicles and Hall's Chronicles. And those things are also produced with a mindset to please the establishment. I think it's interesting that in Henry VIII, also known as All Is True, it finishes with the baptism of Elizabeth, nothing more to see here. But in terms of, for example, the Catherine of Aragon speech in the Blackfriars trial, that's almost verbatim pulled from the Holinshed Chronicle account, or maybe the Hall's Chronicle account, of what she says. So those two things, there is a connection. In some ways, I think that the history plays become much more propagandized in James's rule. When Shakespeare becomes the King's Man, the decision to do Macbeth and to shape that history to fit with the narrative of James's family tree, to me, that's much more propagandized than lots of the stuff that's happened in Elizabeth's reign. Because although these are her kin in some way, shape, or form, the stories he's telling, and although it's a story of how she got to the throne in some ways, it's not, for me, as explicit a connection as Macbeth is to James. I do think it's interesting that Shakespeare writes Richard II during Elizabeth's reign, and he's told by the censors, okay, you've got to take out the deposition scene. So clearly he's produced a play that is politically sensitive enough for the censors to step in and go, not that one. And then, of course, in 1601, Essex and his buddies are like, could you stage Richard II, but this time extra money, put the deposition scene back in. And then the next day the Essex Rebellion happens because that history play becomes politicized. But I think that Shakespeare's history plays are, for me, a theatrical way to understand the conception of history for the people that he is performing to. They would have understood this as their history, I believe. And these are people who could have gone from seeing Shakespeare plays, and they could have gone to Westminster Abbey and they could have seen the helm of Henry V. They could have seen the Agincourt stuff all on display. And maybe they would have seen the effigies of this one, that one, the other one. That's what I think we can say about it. Is it historically accurate for us? No. But it is a really interesting, in my mind, a primary source because it's how they're doing history.
That's a really sophisticated answer, because I was thinking that then in that case, as you said, for us, it's not a historical source. But from what I understand, for his audience, it was supposed to be. And rather than looking at it from our point of view, where we expect Shakespeare to be teaching us history, in fact, he isn't even teaching his own audience history. He is reinforcing the history they know, as you say. He's upholding the established history, which is already communicated by those in power, the elites.
It is a bit strange to me that people will happily kind of quote Hall's Chronicle or Holinshed's Chronicle as a primary historical source, but then they'll dismiss Shakespeare. I'm like, but I do find it strange that people who dismiss Shakespeare as not being a historical source are really happy to quote Hall's Chronicle and Holinshed's Chronicle. And yeah, they might do a bit of like, this is written in the time period, there's an agenda here. But they give it, I feel, more weight than Shakespeare. But my interpretation is that Shakespeare is doing historical fiction based upon those sources. In the current day, Wolf Hall is not a historical source, but trust and believe, you watch it and you can see the research is there. Hilary Mantel has done the labour of looking at the extant sources. And that's what I think. Well, I don't think Shakespeare necessarily is putting that much work in. He's just drawing from the things he has access to.
Yeah, so I think that does speak to intention then. He's not simply fabricating, and at the same time, he's not rehearsing, say, street tales. He is actually making an effort to go to what would be in those days regarded as very respectable historical sources.
Yeah, I think so.
Since you've touched on that question of research method, could you describe your own research method and what quality control measures you take for your videos? Understanding, of course, that your videos are intended to be educational on history, but they're not intended to be academic works. So I'm interested in how you've just juggled that balance.
Yes, academically, you need peer review. So if I wanted to put forward a new theory or a new idea, which in some ways I have done in some videos, I have done what I like to call my conspiracy speculation videos, but I call them conspiracy speculations. I think that they are based in the available evidence, but they have not been peer reviewed. So that's why I downgrade them to conspiracy speculations. So when I'm making these videos, I am going to turn to peer reviewed sources or primary sources. And I'm going to make it clear which ones I'm using. To access those, as I've just had a baby, most of my research is currently done at home. I haven't really got the bandwidth to get myself into the British Library, although that was how I used to do a lot of my research. Since then, since having children and since, the world being on fire from a pandemic, lots of libraries have made their resources available for a cost into your home. And the London Library is one of those. There are others available, I have no doubt, but I use the London Library, and that gives me access to JSTOR, so secondary sources, journals, EBO, early English books online, things that have been digitized, go straight into those. We've also got British History Online. Those are the calendar of state papers. Just trying to think of what else. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, the Oxford English Dictionary, newspaper archives, things that you see rocking up in my videos. And of course, there are open access resources that are made by educational institutions, and they have that credibility of being perhaps AHRC funded or something similar. Those are the sources that I'm using. I make it clear I know some people show their citations on screen. I choose to put my citations in my comments, in my description box. Same with the images I use. The images I choose to use are almost always from Wikimedia Commons because I don't want to get dinged for copyright. Yeah. While I'm, of course, going to sit in the place of Wikipedia should not be your source for history, what I will also say, and I feel nervous saying this, what's risky is often, not always, but often, if you side by side the Wikipedia entry with the peer-reviewed Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry, they are word for word the same. However, what you need to do is you need to be able to check the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry to see that. So
of course, yes.
That's problematic.
Yeah. The term I've heard used for that is trust but verify.
Yeah, and the thing is that when it comes to for a resource for images to repurpose and to use, you're scarcely going to get better than Wikimedia. Occasionally, I have to start UK and screenshot. Occasionally, I have to go to a newspaper archive to screenshot. But when it comes down to it, Wikimedia Commons, you can't really beat it for open access images.
I really appreciate the fact you've described that, and in particular, your use of sources which typically only academics would have access to, or people working at a university or people attending a university. I was expecting you to say EBO, Early English Books Online, and naturally the Thomason Tracts and those other works. It really struck a chord with me because in the early 90s, when I was doing my own personal historical research, I wanted to read some of those works in the Early English Books collection and in the Thomason Tracts. Living in Melbourne at the time and not having a convenient university account to do that, I would apply at my local public library for microfilm reels of the Early English Books Online. I would search their catalogue, find the microfilm reel I wanted with the books that I wanted in it, get the reel sent to my little local library, then sit down at the microfilm reader printer with a stack of blank paper and just print them out laboriously page by page and then get them spiral bound and take them home and read through them. That was in the early days when obviously the internet was still only starting to be a thing. And a lot of this stuff was, well, some of it actually, I think some of those digitization projects were only quite nascent in that time. Later on, when I did get access through a university, I was thinking, oh my goodness, this is fantastic. I've got JSTOR, I've got EBO, the Thomason tracks. This is amazing. And I downloaded ridiculous number of PDFs. So yeah, that just struck a chord. I'm thinking, oh wow, yeah, I remember in those early days when that kind of material wasn't available. It's amazing how available it is now.
The digitization of things, I just want to point out that has changed the research that's being done. My doctoral thesis would not have been possible if EBO didn't exist. Because my doctoral thesis was on how the words trash and trifle got used from 1519 to 1615. You need, and I also did corpus linguistics with EBO as my corpus. And from that, I was able to say that actually there are spikes in the extant printed material using the words trash and trifle that broadly correlate with moments of crisis. So things like, for example, Reformation, the Anglo-Ottoman trading capitulations. There are these moments where you see these spikes of the word. That work would not have been possible in a doctoral time frame. That would have been a life's work to do that kind of labour without things like EBO and digitization. So as we talk about the changes that tech are bringing, it's going to revolutionise the way we do academics. It's the new stuff is still in its infancy and it's a bit rubbish, but when there will be an application for it, I can't see it yet, but there will be an application for it.
I'm actually very glad that you returned to that topic, because when you mentioned it previously, I thought, yes, I want to come back to this. You've mentioned an important historical source, which I think a lot of people are not very well aware of, lexical or linguistic corpora. And that's a very specialized historical source. And it'd be really great to have you help our audience understand how that's used. I have some familiarity with this as a result of studying Greek and Latin in my undergraduate classics degree. And naturally, we did some lexicography and had to understand diachronic and synchronic lexical analysis. And naturally, we had to understand how the lexicons are formed. So we had to understand how to use a corpora. Later on in my Master of Information Management degree, I spent a lot of time on metadata systems, a lot of which were being used for these corpora. And I actually I've used some English corpora myself. So could you explain to our audience what linguistic or lexical corpora are? We've talked about some terms before previously, hapax legomena, and you might be able to explain how these are useful to the historian.
To be honest, from the way you've just spoken to me, you understand this process far better. One of the issues with doing the kind of work that I did for my thesis is that your toe gets dipped into water and you understand something like the use of corpus linguistics for the purpose that you are using. It's very mercenary. My relationship to corpus linguistics is very mercenary. And so what I did was, I believe it was Lancaster University had a corpus query processor that you could choose a corpora. I chose EBO. I put in the words I wanted, and they told me how many times it appeared, and they gave me a graph. That is my relationship with that.
Okay, that's really interesting. So because of the way that I've experienced corpora, having learned Greek and Latin, obviously, and if you learn Greek and Latin, you have to learn how to use a lexicon, which means you have to understand how a lexicon's been put together, because you can't just say, oh, this lexicon says this. There are all kinds of incredibly awkward edge cases. And when you learn how to read a critical text and you be like, wow, this critical text looks nothing like the English translation, has half a page of footnotes and things like, this is a conjectural reconstruction, or the meaning of this word is uncertain, or a great big lacunae all through the text, this kind of thing. So probably then I've experienced the corpora from the inside out, especially from my information management and metadata studies, whereas you're experiencing the corpora from the outside in, for example, using it as the tool. So you've probably used corpora for historical research more than I have, whereas I've been trained rather on the other side to understand how these function in building lexicons and how they then why they are useful tools for the historian. So for the benefit of our audience, a linguistic or lexical corpus from the Latin body, of course, just means a large body of words, typically in the form of historical texts, from which you can then mine data. You can see how, a bit like the way people use Google Trends to figure out which terms are trending on Google at the moment, very much. That's another kind of corpus. There are many current modern corpora which exist online, which are used in linguistic studies. And as an English teacher, I've used some of those myself. And there are historical corpora, that is very large bodies of historical texts in languages like English and other languages, Greek and Latin. And students of history and students of lexicography, the meaning of words, search through those for all the instances of words so they can get an understanding of how these words were used either across time, which is diachronic analysis, or in a particular short time frame, synchronic analysis, comparing how they're used with other words within this given period. And that's how lexicographers and later editors of dictionaries can compile lists of meanings. They can start to build the lexical range and the semantic domain, classify the semantic domain of these words. And sometimes you find words which may be only used 3 times in 500 years, or you find a word in a Greek corpus which is only used once, where you have a word which is used so rarely, in fact, it may only be used once in your entire corpus, that you don't know and exactly don't have any broader context to establish what it means. This is what's referred to as a hapax legomenon, plural legomena, a word that...
That's a great word.
Yeah, the words which you just can't be certain of the meaning of because you don't have enough context. You might only have them used once. There are some classic ones in Greek and also in Latin. So these linguistic corpora, these linguistic and lexical corpora, are extremely useful for historical studies because not only do they show you literally what people are talking about and what is occupying their minds most and what they think is important to write down, but they also help show you how meanings of language change, words change. And that is a window into history because language is historically shaped. It's a social construct. So it's an extremely important source of socio-historical information. So could you give an example of a search that you did of the corpora to help contextualize its use in a historical context?
So, had the Lancaster University Corpus Query Processor. This now just sounds. You have done your research is the kind of research that does the code that makes the Corpus Query Processor.
Right. Yeah.
I'm the chimp being like bang bang bang, put word into buttons. I selected EBO because I wanted terms in English. I wanted words for the English market because I was specifically interested by the way this word, because it's 1519 is the first recorded use of the word trash to mean something of little
fascinating.
value. Prior to that, it was about destruction. My argument is that even though it has this new meaning, it maintains the old meaning even to this day. The valuelessness of things we call trash, we have in our mindset that it's still destructive, that it somehow is infective to the community around it. So what I did was I also used the word trifles because it's about these things of little value. But trifles is an older word. So I put trash into the Corpus Query Processor in EBO, and I then was essentially looking for various spellings because it's spelt numerous different ways with random E's and extra S's, etc. And I just wanted it to kind of see across that almost century period, where are the spikes? When are we seeing it growing? And of course, it's also a period where print is growing. So there is elements to which this is a bit of a fool's errand. And we're also, with EBO, we are reliant on these being texts that are extant and also that have been digitized sufficiently to be used by the Corpus Query Processor by 2014, 2015. So I'm looking at these spikes, and in almost every case, a spike connected to a moment that would create anxiety over value. So when it comes to talking about the Reformation, we start hearing about papal trifles and papal trish trash all the way through. And then by the time you get to Shakespeare, where I end my tale, if you will, or really the Elizabethan and Jacobean stages where I end my tale, what you see, interestingly, is that there is now a lot of use of trash. On Shakespeare's stage, if I take the play Othello, I think it's very interesting the way the word trash is used. Othello features the word trash is the most out of any of the extant Shakespeare plays. It comes up 3 times. In every case, Iago says it. Who steals my purse steals trash, this poor trash of Venice whom I trace, and another trash. So, and I think that's a sign that there is a distorted valuation system in the world of Othello that allows Iago to become the arbiter of value, and that makes him dangerous. But I think that Shakespeare and his fellow playwrights are staging trash because they are attempting to assert their right to be arbiters of value in a world that sees them as being little more than transients.
Right. So
and suspicious.
The use of the word is very specific and coded for that purpose. Right.
I believe so.
Excellent.
I believe by the time it gets to Shakespeare's time, it's getting loads of layers put on top of it.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot for that example. Related to that, continuing our discussion of your research process, I noticed on your channel that you've mentioned your use of various historiographies or historiographical methods. For our audience, a historiographical method is a method of analyzing history. And even though historians tend to talk about the historiographical method, which means generally the process by which all historians work, within the historiographical method, there are different historiographies, different ways of using this method for different purposes. So could you please describe the historiographical methods which you follow and perhaps how they are different to other historiographies? For example, if you mainly follow the Anglo-European method or the continental method, and more specifically, if you apply historiographic theories and approaches such as post-colonialism and feminist theory.
So because my studies were done in the world of literature, the basis, I would say, for my historiography is literary history. And then on top of that, cultural history. Increasingly, though, the work becomes about objects and things. Books are things, but so too are paintings, so too is clothing, etc., etc. So when I was doing my doctoral thesis, there layers onto that the use of the techniques of art history, the techniques of economic history. I also had some training in things like queer theory and post-colonial literature, post-colonial history. And so those are the things, that sort of training, that understanding, they are the things that I apply to, depending on the video I'm making, I will work on those things. If, for example, when I was making my video on John White's watercolours of the native indigenous people of Americas that he encountered when he went to what becomes Virginia, there is an approach to that is art historical. There's also, you have to understand how people do and have done ethnography. So there is a kind of connection there to anthropology and anthropological study. But also, because this is a text of a colonial force, and I would argue that it's a text that's designed to inspire that colonial force, you also have to read those images in a post-colonial context. You have to have that understanding of their purpose. So I feel like when it comes to the historiographies that I use, I have to confess to being a bit of a magpie and using the thing that's going to serve the story I want to tell.
Yeah, that makes sense. Although I think that, to your credit, I would say, I think less of a magpie, which suggests more of an arbitrary choice, but I would say perhaps more like a craftsman using a toolbox and selecting the specific tool for the use case.
That's very kind. I try.
Because, I think because I think that is literally the function of different historiographies. Sometimes we need to look at history from a very specific perspective. And in order to do that, you need to use certain methods. For example, some of them may require you to do what we would know as referred to as reading against the grain, where you're reading your historical source and not taking it at face value, but rather anticipating that because of its context, actually, not necessarily that it's trying to deceive you, but that it's coming from a very specific perspective, which will mislead you if you take it at face value. So you have to read it with the understanding that what is being said is very likely a specific distortion or manipulation of the facts. Maybe not even consciously, but if it's an elite, for example, talking about a social event or a historical event, they will just have a different perspective, and you have to read that with some resistance. And it's not simply that you think, oh, well, everything they say, well, the opposite must have happened. It's more sophisticated than that, obviously, but you have to remember that this is a pinhole view into this historical event, And as a result, it's going to be biased, and there are going to be some personal artifacts of the author which are going to be introduced, which may occlude or distort the actual history. And you've mentioned the post-colonial approach or post-colonial theory. Could you briefly describe what that means for the benefit of our audience as somebody who does use it academically?
I shall try.
Maybe even you just give an illustration of what it means to have a post-colonial approach.
Yes. So let's for example, take those John White watercolor images. In essence, a post-colonial approach to looking at those images is an understanding that what I am being fed here, what I am being shown, is coming from a space that assumes that, first of all, in quotes, white is right. It also comes from a place where there is going to be an impetus or an attempt maybe to convert a notion of the supremacy of Christianity, the supremacy of whiteness, and the text produced by the people who are part of that paradigm and who are in later years writing, supporting it, even if it's not actively like, this is a great thing to have done. But if you occupy a place where you're writing from empire, so Victorian texts, for example, where they're very proud about the sun never setting on the empire, those texts, when they are talking about other peoples, other in quotations there, other nations that they have colonized, that is part of their empire, we have to read those texts with the assumption and the knowledge that they are assuming the correctness of their place. And so when you're doing post-colonial work, you have to unpick, and particularly as a white woman, you have to unpick your own biases of your place in the world and the capacity for your nation to know the right thing. And so it is about looking at those texts that are produced in service of that and then decoding them and not just going, well, of course, this is the correct thing to have done. There's possibly a better way of explaining it, but that's what I've got.
I think that's great, because I think what you've done really is place the emphasis on what that word post means. And there's a lot of lay confusion, I think, about what that means. Yes, sometimes it does mean examining sources written after a colonial period has ended, although there's quite a lot of debate about when colonial eras end or when neocolonialism starts, but that's another subject. So it's not just about examining texts within a time frame, that is, the individual who's examining them is looking at the texts later than the colonial period. So the person analysing the text is positioned in time after the colonial period which they are examining. And so, yes, that is a part of it. But I think more to the point, as you've mentioned, is it's about the author consciously placing themselves outside that colonial context, because that text was written within a particular colonial context to other people who were also within that context and who took that context for granted as a framework of truth. But you're stepping outside that, and so you could say post-colonial theory or post-colonial approach is a critical theory, a critical lens, whereby the examiner of history or the student of history is consciously aware that this text or this source was produced within a specific colonial context, and they are removing themselves from that context and looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, which is why the word post rather than ex is quite relevant, and consciously critiquing it, whilst at the same time, as you mentioned very importantly, divesting themselves or attempting to divest themselves of their own personal biases, which may be related to or even products of that original colonial context. So I think that word post is doing a lot of heavy lifting, but I do think it's legitimate. To some extent, it's post meaning after. To some extent, it's post meaning outside, or so we could say X, for example. But I think that you summed up very well the fact that it's this self-awareness, which is the critical element, that you are not taking this text at face value. You understand, on the one hand, what it meant to the generator of the source and what is intended to mean to the original audience within that historical context or within that colonial context, but you can't read it like that. You have to read it from two different perspectives. You can understand what it was intended to say, but you have to understand what does it teach us who are outside that context? What does it teach us now after that colonial period? And I really like in particular that self-awareness that you described, which is critical for any historian, obviously.
Yeah, and I was thinking your word of where you clarify, you attempt to remove yourself.
Yes, of course. I think
that there is. I have seen that there is, I think, a very well-meaning trend, but a fundamentally erroneous trend of particularly historians who exist in the place where empire started, who are essentially products of empire, if you will, that they believe that they can extract themselves from their imperial history, that they aren't fully a product of it. You can do your best, but at certain points there is always going to be that bias that you're going to have to the work is never done in unpacking that bias. You will find nooks and crannies in your mind where you go, oh, that's interesting that I've assumed that that's the way it should be. The study of history, I often say, is a couple of things. Students of history are inherently nosy, we're gossips, but also I think that the true student of history is almost trying to heal something psychologically. They're unpacking why their brain, why their lived experience functions the way it does through their understanding of history, I think.
Thank you for that. I think that's fantastic because it really does remind people that the work of a historian is of a human in a particular socio-historical context, attempting to understand a socio-historical context from which they are removed, not just chronologically, not just geographically, but conceptually. And that conceptually part is the critical part. Well, we've come to the end of our time, and actually this interview has been timed really perfectly. I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time and answering all my questions to such a great extent and contributing a level of depth and detail to your answers, which I know our audience will really benefit from. I'm really delighted to have had a conversation with somebody who's not just qualified, but specializes in a niche area, because, you know, that's where all the interesting conversations happen. I really like to thank you again for taking this time. And for those of you who are viewing this video and are interested, have a look at the video description where I've placed a link to Kat's channel. And I've also linked to some of my favorite videos of hers, which I think showcase her research and her ability to communicate history very well.
Thank you.